Welcome, everybody. This is the 10th symposium series, and the title of our autumn series is Genes and Metabolism, Bioelectricity, and the Quantum Spark of Life. And the title of this second session is Electrical Circuits and Biology, Quantum or Classical. And we welcome today our very good friend and colleague, Greg Scholes from Princeton. And he's going to be speaking on quantum-like states in complex networks. Betony, it's over to you to introduce Greg.
Thanks so much, Geoffrey. It gives me really great pleasure to introduce Professor Greg Scholes for the second session of the autumn series. Greg's talks are always really fascinating, and I always learn something new. So Greg is the William S. Todd Professor of Chemistry at Princeton University. He's originally from Melbourne, but he started his independent career at the University of Toronto, where he was the D.J. Leroy Distinguished Professor. He is also a Fellow of the Royal Society for both London and Canada. He's Editor-in-Chief for the Journal of Physical Chemistry Letters. He is also Director of the Energy Frontier Research Center, Bio-Inspired Light Escalated Chemistry. This is just a snapshot of his many achievements. Greg's many interests that include how complex molecular systems in chemistry and biology interact with light, how quantum mechanical phenomena influence function. Experimental work uses ultrafast lasers to time processes and reveal details of light-matter interactions through multi-dimensional electronic spectroscopy. He develops and applies theoretical models to better understand experimental results. His scope of interest is incredibly broad, and his research projects include questions in quantum information science, photobiomodulation medicine, cavity quantum electrodynamics, photosynthesis, solar energy conversion, excitonic materials, and mechanisms of photoactivated catalysis in synthetic chemistry. He has also given some really excellent presentations to the Guy Foundation about his work on synchronization in biological systems. Greg has a prolific research output with many papers in high-profile journals. This is a very small sample of some papers to introduce the context of this session, which is electrical circuits in biology and whether they can be described using quantum or classical models. In the first session of the autumn series, we heard from Michiel Sipra about how life is fundamentally electric, and he took us through the first electrical experiments on frogs by Galvani, to the emerging evidence that life is quite literally shaped by electric potentials. And this is important at the subcellular level, where proteins, for example, have very interesting electronic properties, but it is also important to the ways in which cells behave collectively. And today's talk by Greg will build on both these levels by looking at whether circuits or networks of chromophores, or indeed groups of cells, are best described by quantum mechanics. Very briefly, what do we mean when we say that electrical networks are quantum? So in quantum biology, this is often taken to mean that the movement of charge in some system of interest shows novel quantum properties such as superposition, coherence, tunneling, or entanglement. And I think Greg is going to address in more detail what these effects are. And where exactly are these circuits or networks that we are talking about? Where are these charges actually moving? Well, Greg is well known in the quantum biology community for his work on coherence, energy, and charge transfer between networks of chromophores, which are light-sensitive molecules such as chlorophyll and tryptophan that are found in proteins. And this charge transfer is fundamental to electron transport chains that drive essential biological functions such as photosynthesis or metabolism. And finally, in addition to these subcellular networks of chromophores, Greg will also discuss how the electrical networks of neurons might be best described using quantum mechanics and what insights this may give us into how the brain works. And I'll let Greg tell us more about it.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, thanks for having me here today. And so the talk is broad in the sense that it will hopefully get you thinking about a whole lot of different areas that are of interest to each of you. And there's some specific topics to give concrete examples here. But we're going to be thinking about networks and their properties and how to think about quantum mechanics or something like that on this huge scale. So start just by getting us thinking even more broadly and motivating some of what I'll talk about. So I just read this earlier this week article about Terence Tao in The Atlantic, where I quote here, the Mozart of math. He's sometimes called, is widely considered the world's greatest living mathematician. He's a professor at UCLA. And right now, AI is nowhere close to his level. And this is the idea of this article. So, what is it that, you can have in the human mind that we can't reproduce with computers, even though AI models are very common for describing neural circuits, with really good predictability. It's not everything that's happening in the brain. I just wanted to start with a definition here, some language I'm going to use briefly. Is that in computer science, the kinds of problems that you might want to address with an algorithm that are the most difficult to solve, these so-called NP-complete problems. So they're really, really hard to solve, but they can be verified in practice. So in polynomial time is what they say. And there's many examples that we're familiar with. So we can appreciate a Mozart concerto, but composing it in the first place is really, really difficult. So that's the NP complete part that Mozart took care of. And there are many other examples, for example, solving a really difficult mathematical theorem. And usually they're much more easy to verify. We always say things are easy once you know the answer. So solving these difficult problems or creating amazing things requires genius. That's what, I guess, the definition of genius. And this is what Terence Tao has that AI does not have. So the question is, what is it that it enables these kinds of insight that define genius? What produces, for instance, something so simple as we've all had the aha moment when you finally understand how to solve a problem or understand a concept somebody's explaining to you. And this aha moment is actually a concept in psychology. You can look up some papers on it if you're interested. So one thing that has been thought about in the literature is that solving these kind of hard problems, where you get this leap of insight that we associate with genius, is enabled largely by how we arrange the information that we have, that we know. So these ideas typically don't come out of thin air. You have the background. Terence Tao is a trained mathematician, and it's how he takes what he knows and maybe brings ideas from different fields together and arranges that enables the leaps of insight. So that suggests that maybe a way of thinking about this problem would be, well, is there a special way that the brain can use to structure and combine information that gives us the ability, to come up with these amazing thoughts and breakthroughs. So the specific question is, what is that structure? So here's the summary of that. Is there a special structure in the brain network that can be employed for a kind of quantum advantage? And quantum is an interesting word to add here. It doesn't have to be a quantum advantage, but I'd like to discuss what that might mean in a situation so complex as how the brain works for these specific kinds of problems. So what does that structure look like is the key question. And just as, again, a little bit of background, since I've mentioned the word quantum, I'll give you an entire graduate class in 1 minute. So the classic example for talking about quantum states are these 4 states, and it doesn't matter if you're not familiar with how we write quantum mechanical states or wave functions, but there's four ways of arranging information, in particular superpositions, that are called the Bell states. And many of you will have heard of entanglement and the Bell inequality, and it's all comes from these equations. And really all it is if I have two systems, say two atoms, for instance, it could be, each one of them could be in two states, which we label 0 or 1. And so one of the atoms we call A, usually Alice, and the other is B for Bob. And the key point about these equations that define entanglement, which is, by the way, a really, really difficult concept to wrap your head around, is that with any of these states, the information is represented in this so-called product form. It's tensor product, technically. And this is the representation of information in a quantum system. So if you look at the top equation there, you see that we have 0A, 1B. It's a product state. That's telling you that in this basis, atom A is in the 0, atom B is in the 1 state. And then you see that the rest of the equation adds on the opposite possibility, is that atom A is in the 1 state, atom B is in the 0 state. And this is the famous superposition of products that Schrödinger said was the hallmark of quantum mechanics. And the idea of it is that the magic of quantum information and quantum mechanics comes in this structure. So what's going to happen here, it's a bit of a simplification, but it's a good way to think about it. If we're given this quantum mechanical system and Alice does a measurement, and Alice is here in Princeton and Bob is in London, and they share this quantum state, which we prepared earlier. Alice does a measurement, you can see, because she could equally measure a 0 or a 1. There's actually nothing that would bias one or the other. And the same with Bob, by the way. And Alice does a measurement and she finds that she's holding the 0 in her atom. Bob does a measurement, and previously he could have equally measured a 1 or a 0, but now, because of Alice's measurement, Bob will measure a 1. And so this is what troubled Einstein. It seemed to be that after Alice does her measurement, information is transmitted faster than the speed of light that will determine the outcome of Bob's measurement. And this is still rather an open question on how to interpret this, but this is stuff that these correlations you can't get classically. So there's oh yes, I guess I should have done this so we could focus on that equation. And I'm just showing this because I want to mention the terminology here. What this leads to is probability law that looks different than classical. So in classical probabilities, we have probability as a number between 0 and 1. And in quantum mechanics, probability is presented as a matrix. So the classical probability laws would be on the diagonal of the matrix. You can see on the left picture here, this would just be, oh, okay, well, we have some system where it's equally likely to be in any one of 4 states. So it's like a dice with 4 sides, in a low dimensional space, something. So it's a 1/4 probability for any of the outcomes, or a 4-headed coin, if you like. Quantum mechanically, it's going to look different because it's going to acquire additional structure on the off-diagonal parts of the matrix, and that's where these magical correlations come in. But it's all about this tensor product. So these superpositions of tensor products that's in the Bell state. So yeah, for some of you, that may be too much. For others, maybe you'll get just a glimpse of this. It doesn't matter really for the rest of the talk, except that if we're going to talk about quantum, you need to realize that this is something that you can articulate clearly for very small systems. Something this small is probably irrelevant on the scale of the brain, and that's what I want to get to. In addition, these kinds of states that are not trivial, when they're not trivial, at least tend to be fragile. That's why quantum computers are really hard to build. So scaling this up to the biological scale presents a lot of problems. So that's why this question is interesting and has intrigued people for a long time. Is there special structure in brain networks that can be exploited for some kind of quantum advantage? What does that structure look like? So, at first pass of this question, it seems unlikely because the scale of the number of entangled bits here makes it difficult to preserve entanglement. It's also, by the way, an NP complete problem to work out if there is any entanglement or if the state, at least technically, is non-separable on that scale, but it can also be very fragile. There's a whole lot of reasons why this should not be the case. And that's what I say here. Even Schrödinger famously mentioned this, warm, wet, and noisy environments and no place for quantum systems. So that's the consensus, but maybe there's a way around this, and that's what I want to talk about. That's more generally applicable, and this is where it gets perhaps more interesting. So in Roger Penrose's book, Shadows of the Mind, he explores the ideas of whether quantum mechanics could matter in the brain. And he makes this really important point that if that's ever going to be the case, then we're going to need to find quantum systems, that are not our usual examples that, are fragile, but that at huge scales preserve quantum effects. And as I said, this seems really unlikely, but I'm going to present an idea where maybe this is possible. On the left, by the way, is the map of every single circuit in the fruit fly brain, which is now being resolved by my colleagues just through the green stuff that you see outside the window here. So the question is, could it be that we don't need to worry about all of these problems with the quantum states? Could it be that classical systems, networks, circuits, electrical, neural, whatever you would like, social networks even, can they somehow generate states that look like quantum states? It's a pretty interesting idea that I'll develop here, or at least I think it's interesting. So, what you want to picture in your mind, imagine you could construct a huge, complex classical system, as classical as that fruit fly brain, at a minimum. Maybe the fruit fly brain isn't sufficient. Maybe we need a mouse brain or a huge network on social media. And that we have a real network like that any of us can imagine. And that I'll show you how we can translate that network into states like physicists are familiar with from quantum mechanical systems. So the idea that we'd like to develop here is an existence theorem that says that these robust quantum-like states can be found in quantum systems. So we need these because we're going to have huge complex systems that we don't really mind too much about, the temperature. It can be ambient. They need to be robust. So they can't be fragile like a quantum computer. And because we're constructing them from classical system, I'm going to be careful here and call them quantum-like. Okay, not quantum. So it's not clear that these states are precisely the same ones that we would get, say, from atoms in the quantum world. It's also not obvious that they're not remarkably similar. So here's the big picture. On the quantum scale, I gave you that brief graduate class on entanglement and so on. This is what we see on the quantum scale. Ladders of states. That's the hallmark of quantum mechanical systems. That the levels don't have to be continuous. But the states are fragile, as I said, and they have this special basis, this so-called tensor product basis. Then when the system gets too big and complex, or temperature gets high, for instance, we end up with classical physics. So there's some kind of transition from quantum to classical, which is still an open question, how to identify that. What I'm going to propose is that once we have a big classical system, we can apply some very simple rules to it and refocus things so that emerging out of this, we get these quantum-like states, which again are ladders of states, but now they're not fragile, they're robust, and they also have exactly the same state structure that you need in the quantum scale, because this is the basis for superpositions and entanglement. So to do this, we kind of need an intermediary that's going to translate our classical system into the quantum system, and this is a graph. So I need to tell you a little bit about the graphs. Okay, and the graph is going to be a single entity that could represent is the picture we're going to draw that translates the properties of social networks. It could be neural networks, game networks, so you can make games on these graphs with special kinds of rules that you can make up. Electronic oscillators that we could program into a circuit is another one. It's a good one, actually. Partially ordered sets, bioreactions in our body, if we like. They're linked by kinetics. So let's use the example of social networks. Each of the nodes, the little circles on the graph, would be a person in that case. And the lines called edges of the graph are telling us, well, which people are talking to which other people, okay, and exchanging ideas or trying to convince each other of a particular point of view. So you get the sense that we can draw a graph that would depict, sort of almost any large classical system that we have in mind. The key thing is that we're going to need here is a lot of edges. So a lot of talking between the people is crucial. Otherwise, it becomes kind of uninteresting. And one of the big questions here are there special ways to wire these circuits together that will give us these quantum states and ideally some kind of quantum advantage. So again, a little bit of background here. So we've got our classical system, set of oscillators, our biochemical reactions linked together, social network, whatever it is, and it will have a structure. So if you just look at the top of this slide here, here's some drawings of very small networks which showing their structure. So if it's the people in the social network, and the lines, remember how they talk to each other. Once we have this drawing, then any of you, of course, could do for a system that's of interest to you right now. It turns out that you can immediately define states associated. It doesn't matter whether you can measure those states in their spectrum. If these were oscillators linked together, you say electronic oscillators in a circuit, you could measure a spectrum of the frequencies that this entire graph would generate by coupling them. The frequency spectrum could be measured with a spectrum analyzer on the circuit, and it would be a real spectrum, and that's plotted below here. So these eigenvalues, which is the x-axis, is just telling you where the different frequencies are, say the musical notes of an oscillator circuit here, which are going to be different from the individual nodes here because of the coupling. Okay, it creates this fingerprint spectrum, and there's associated states with them. That's what we're going to relate to the quantum world. And social network, you could say, well, what is the spectrum? You know, when people are talking to each other on Twitter or whatever it is, we don't measure, you know, some new frequencies. Of course not in that case, but we can still define exactly the same spectrum, even though we can't measure it, and the states too, which tell us something about the network. Okay, so in some cases, our classical system naturally has a spectrum, a fingerprint of frequencies like I've drawn in the lower panels. Sometimes it doesn't, but we can always propose this structure and use it to analyze the system. So by popular demand from the organizers, I can give a specific example here of a system where we could, a molecular system, where we could draw the nodes, the vertices, and how they connect with each other and what the function that comes about is, and what the prediction is. And what it's going to do also is give you a sense for what we actually need if this is going to get interesting. So these microtubules are proteins, and they come in these dimers, and embedded in them, of course, their proteins are amino acids, and the red ones colored in that dimer are tryptophan. We can photoexcite this tryptophan in these proteins. Proteins are very long, of course, once they're assembled, and we can watch. So when the light is absorbed, we get this excitation in the protein, and we can watch that excitation move through these structures. And the question is, how far does it move? So if we wanted quantum states, for example, on the scale where we might imagine all of these tubulin dimers as a quantum bit or something, it would have to instantly delocalize over many of the dimers to form a kind of quantum state. Not really the kind we need for computing, but would still be interesting. And so, you know, let's do a measurement that could see if that's possible here. And that will tell us something about what we need in these graphs. So the way to do this is to make a series of tubulin dimers. And we can do this by taking, a series of microtubules constructed with these tubulin dimers that are tagged with a fluorophore that deactivates the excitation. So anytime you excite one of the tubulin dimers that has the little pink spot on it, it's going to deactivate the excitation. Okay. And so what we want to do, and so we're putting the energy in the tryptophan. It'll move tryptophan to tryptophan through the protein until it finds one of these tags, and then it will be deactivated. And we can kind of do a dilution experiment here to see at what point, what density of these traps that we put on here do we need to deactivate the tryptophan. So in other words, if the energy moves between the tryptophans over huge distances along the microtubule, we could still quench it with very dilute trap population. So lower down in the picture here. If that's not the case, if it doesn't move very far, then we need to have the traps close to the initial excitation in order to quench the fluorescence. So we do this dilution experiment. We study each of these samples in solution that I've shown here, and we do a measurement of the fluorescence. And we're actually measuring the time evolution of the fluorescence and seeing how quickly we can decay it. And we're taking all of that information, putting the data on these plots here. We have a whole lot of samples, but it's going to be easier to look at this little bar chart here. And we can translate all of this into how far the excitation moved. And this is what we really want to get, the diffusion length. So it turns out with the microtubules, it can be 7 nanometers according to these experiments. So if you think about what that is physically, it's a little bit more than the dimer. So it's not, when we put excitation into the tryptophan, it's not forming delocalized coherent states, which might have a quantum advantage over many of the dimers, which might be useful. It is moving further and faster than what we'd predict with well-known theories. So that is interesting. It's also interesting, it's affected by anesthetics and also by snake venom. So there's interactions with these small molecules with the microtubules that affect what's happening with this excitation. But one of the take-homes, not just from this experiment, but from others, is that if we just, if we have the edges in our graphs, which is the interaction between the tryptophans, that is kind of nearest neighbor. In other words, we have an interaction from one tryptophan to the ones it can see in a radius, but we don't have the same interaction that would go a very long way down the microtubule, then we're not going to get really interesting effects formed. So you need, in other words, you need very, very complex linkages through a network to get interesting states. And this is why I've been focused the talk on neural networks, where we can do this. It turns, so maybe another way of saying this, it matters how you link the vertices in the graph here. So it matters what our classical structure looks like. If we have a social network that looks like the top left graph, where each person just talks to the next person, this is whispering monkeys. We've all heard of that analogy. This is a very poor way to transmit information, and certainly not a way to produce a stable quantum system. Yeah, I'm not sure if you can hear the noise outside the window, but sorry about that. I can't do anything about it. But there's other ways of arranging graphs that are very complex that become much more interesting. And this is what produced the robust states that I'd like to talk to you about briefly. So a good analogy to these kind of states is the following. This is the Millennium Bridge, many of you will know. Early in the morning, as people walk across it, you can walk at whatever pace you like. Some people will be slow, some people will be fast. Or you know what it's like to walk across a bridge, of course. But on occasion, everybody wants to come across the bridge, especially when it first opened and it was super crowded. And then everybody had to walk in lockstep, everybody pretty much at the same pace, together, all synchronized, so you didn't bump into the person in front of you. And what people observed under those conditions, the entire bridge started swaying. So just a very small force of everybody's footstep on the bridge, because it was synchronized, you get this emergent phenomenon, and very, very powerful, much more powerful than you'd imagine. And this is what we can exploit in these networks. So turns out if you make a network where every person in the network or every neuron in the network is linked to many others, so K others in this example, where K might be 10, it might be 30, it might be 100, then you end up getting a spectrum where you have a single emergent state like the bridge oscillating, the Millennium Bridge. And this is what we want here. So this is going to be the state that comes out of a completely classical system that is, comes away from all the other 100,000 states you might get in that classical system. So it's just one unique state like you have in a quantum system, a single state. But you can get it from a classical system. And you might wonder how, you could do this. Is this really difficult to engineer? Well, there's, this is not how you do it, but this is sort of an example that will illustrate two things. Firstly, all you need is really one rule. The rule I had in the graphs was that every vertex talks to k others. You can make other rules for generating patterns where you start with one black square and all these white ones next to it. Apply the rule over and over and over. So just as one single rule. And in general, if you look at the big triangle, you could say, well, on some scale, it seems like it's completely disordered, but you look back and you say, oh, but there is a pattern here, like the pattern on the shell that's shown. So we have disorder with the states in the middle here, and the pattern that emerges comes out in a single state. Very easy to do in a complex system. Here's a cartoon of it. There's special, really interesting mathematical reasons that you probably don't care about that guarantee this single state, the pattern that I was showing you, or the bridge oscillations, is completely separated in the spectrum from everything else. And it's also a bit like a seesaw, where that beautifully low entropy emergent state, the quantum state, is counterbalanced by the complete randomness of all the other states. Okay, so we don't need, that's why it's not fragile. It's counterbalanced by disorder, which the universe loves. So last couple of things quickly is, this gives us a state that's robust and so on, but we need a quantum bit. So we need Alice or Bob. Remember, Alice and Bob were two-level systems. So we need to kind of make an atom, an Alice atom, by combining the k-regular graphs. And we can do this by taking two of those graphs and just putting a small fraction of connections between them. It's like taking two social networks that are strongly connected and saying, okay, well, only 20% of the people in each of those two networks are allowed to talk to each other on Twitter. And then what we'll get is something where our emergent state splits and it generates a superposition of two possibilities, that this is our atom we've made from a social network or a neural network. And the final thing we would need to do here is form a molecule by taking many atoms together. If we just took two atoms, the Alice and the Bob atom, then we'd end up making the Bell states that I showed you earlier. You don't need to worry too much about mathematics of all of this, but we need to generate from the graphs, or we need to show what we need to do to those graphs that will produce these famous linear combinations or superpositions of the tensor product states. That's the hallmark of quantum mechanics, as stated by Schrödinger. So we need some map on the graphs that will generate those states. And this, this is a well-known operation on the graphs called the product or Cartesian product of graphs. So this is an example of two very small graphs. It generates this way bigger, more complex one, but embedded in that is this beautiful structure that you have in quantum states. I won't go into the details of it. That's on the archive if you're interested. So I'll give a little summary on what you might, what we might conclude from all of this. Is that what I did go through is how we could start at the quantum, inspired by the quantum scale, that turns into the classical scale. We get this, we can, with a simple rule, we can refocus to these states produced by any classical system of sufficient complexity that will generate the same state space that we have in a quantum system. So to do that, we needed this intermediary that that maps any of our classical system to the quantum states, and that's the graphs, because the graphs give a picture of the connections in the classical system, and the graphs, on the graphs we can define states, which we need for the quantum system. So it gives a bit of insight into the quantum advantage in quantum computing and the algorithms. Okay, in a quantum computer, you would bring together the quantum bits, which might be atoms, which would be the two graphs on the left. And the state space looks like the graph on the right. Okay, so, exponentially bigger. This is the advantage of a quantum computer. So a classical computer would look on the right. Quantum computer would look like the system on the left, to some extent, simplifying it a bit. That graph looked super complicated and messy, right, that you see here. But actually, in it is this beautiful structure of correlations laid out that tells that gives a different way of organizing information. And it comes about because of the way we produce the new network by these interactions. So coming back to the start of the talk, we said that genius is enabled by how we arrange information, and research in that area suggests that there's some underlying structure for encoding and combining information. Gives you this idea of, thinking outside the box. And we asked, what is that question? What is that structure? Give some example of this. The architect for Sydney Opera House was inspired by a number of elements of nature, including peeling the orange here, for instance. So he brought together all his knowledge of architecture with some other information, kind of in a superposition, and produced this renowned piece of architecture. So somehow in the brain, there's a way of bringing together these disparate but well-developed networks of thinking in a structure. And it's possible that this structure is this organization on the graphs, the tensor product basis, that intrinsically combines different permutations of selected information, and then we can also use superpositions to combine it further. You might ask the question, could we process on these kind of networks? So, the brain has to function, or networks in our body need to have some kind of function. Producing these kinds of networks and using readouts of the states, give another an additional way that these networks can function. Okay, it's an additional capability, and it can happen in ambient temperature with noise, with disorder, and so on. So you might imagine something intermediate between what you could do in a classical computing system and a quantum computing system on these networks. You might say, well, does the brain have the capacity in principle to contain such states? Whether or not it uses them, that's a whole different question. It would be difficult to address that, but it's pretty easy to show that those networks of this complexity and this structure do exist in the brain. What would be the nodes in the network? If you want to get to the concrete essence of it, it could be the on-off states of neurons. So that's a bit like the network of a game or a social network. Or it could be the oscillations of the neurons, and now it's like an oscillator network, which would really have a spectrum, and the brain could have a detector for that spectrum, which would be a readout of the states, for instance. And maybe regardless of any quantum-like function or readout, it could just be the way of organizing information in these networks that's the key, this product basis, which is hard to wrap your head around, but it's a different way of organizing information. It's a way of putting it into sets, comparable sets, called partially ordered sets, that can help that can give us a pathway through very complex information systems. It's easier to search than another kind of index of information. So let me leave you with that thought, and thanks again for inviting me, and hopefully all of these crazy ideas will lead to some kind of discussion.